everyone, this is Paul Casey, the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame Educational Video Series, where we discuss Kenpo principles, ideas, theories, and we also have special conversations with members of the Kenpo community. Tonight, we have a very special guest with us, Senior Master of the Arts, Dennis Conatser, who is a member of the Kenpo Karate Hall of Fame. Mr. Conatser has been in the Kenpo world for a long, long time. The last 12 years of Mr. Parker's life, Dennis, along with two other individuals, spent considerable time when Parker was writing, defining, and presenting the Infinite Insights series. There's other things that he talked about, so we might bring those up in the conversation. Also with us, very happy to see Zach Carter. Mr. Carter's been in the Kenpo world since 1989. He originally started the Tracy system, then he moved over and trained directly with Frank Trejo, receiving his first black belt in 1998. Since then, he has been progressively increasing his knowledge and experience and training, and presently he is an associate professor in American Kenpo. In other words, he is a 5th degree black belt. So both of you gentlemen, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you, Paul.
Well, good to have you. Now, today we're going to go follow along the educational video series of Mr. Parker's Infinite Insights. And the series that I've developed that I want to talk about is Beyond Infinite Insights. In other words, the discussion of taking the rudiments of Mr. Parker's theories, his lessons, his writings, and then we discuss it, and then we explore some ideas and concepts with it. And the importance of doing all this is very simple. In the martial arts, when you look at our study, there are 3 parts that are very essential: by the mind, body, and spirit, and that is the concepts and principles I use with the Hall of Fame. I truly think it's important that we increase our knowledge, and I think the important thing that if you look at this, I'm going to quote 3 individuals, or actually more. I'm going to quote Sun Tzu, Ed Parker, and Miyamoto Musashi with the Book of 5 Rings. Miyamoto has a quote: "You train as if you're going to war." So we do that by education. We don't show up at the battlefield and decide, hey, we're going to wing this matter. We better have a plan. And training is essential through knowledge, experience, discussions, and lessons. And the martial arts life is more than just fighting. There's so much more to it, as I've had discussions with many of our seniors. Now, Mr. Parker, in his wisdom, he says that there are 3 stages of knowledge. And I think this is really important. This is from the Zen of Kenpo. And Mr. Parker calls it on page 60. He says the knowledge is divided into 3 stages of attaining comprehensive knowledge. And they are the embryonic basics, complexity, and sophisticated simplicity. And so Mr. Conatser will discuss that with us in a few minutes so that we can have that. And then finally, we're going to go with Sun Tzu. And if I get this correctly on page 58 here, I want to make sure, because I like using references. These are the treatises of your education background and experience for the martial arts. He who does not study this will be one to make common mistakes, and probably errors may result in the loss of his life. So the point is, in Sun Tzu, he looks at this as saying, hence the saying, one may know how to conquer without being able to do it. Thus, the good fighter is able to secure himself against defeat, but cannot make certain of defeating the enemy. Finally, to see victory only when it is within the ken of a common herd, it's not the acme of excellence. In other words, he's saying, just because you have something there in front of you, you better know how to respond to it, and properly, because in battle, they fought for life, not for points. And that's the way we walk through our life now in our journey. So to borrow from Mike Stone, we are in now, this moment. This is the power of now. We can look at our past, but that's our past. It's done. We can look to our future, but that is not now. But we can take our future and our goals and import them into now, and thus they will become what we want. So our discussion tonight will be on the theory of American Kenpo zones. And we're going to discuss that. We're going to use several of Mr. Parker's books. The references will be, first of all, through volume 1, Infinite Insights. I always like going back to this book because it's so essential. And Al and I discussions with Mr. Conatser, the essential thing is that it really is there. And he looks about that under the chapter 11, page 101 with the 8 preparatory considerations. And we can discuss that in a second. But this is foundation. This is important for us to understand that. Then we have volumes 4 and 5. And in volume 4, we'll be looking at in the table here, which is under chapter 6, page 87, zone theories. And you have dimensional zone theory, repeated emphasis, checking and controlling, zone theory of directional movement, outer rim theory, quadrant zone theory. I know those are favorites of Mr. Carter. He likes to bring those up. I rarely hear anybody talk about these things. So therefore, that's the purpose of today. Finally, in volume 5, which is very interesting, in volume 5, you have discussions as well. And you look at that, and I think, if I'm correct on that, under zones, it would be in chapter 4, and it's called Zone Theories, and it would be page 60. And in page 60, you look at that, and it will give you an insight into, it's sort of glossed over, what you saw in Infinite Insights Volume 4, but he talks about target areas, and the zone theory is dimensional zone theory, targets, etc., etc. So we're going to get into that. So, Mr. Conatser, and I'm going to call you Dennis, and I'm going to call you Zach throughout our conversation, because we are want to follow Mr. Parker's way of addressing people, though he was always Mr. Parker to me. I'm sorry, I am, but you guys are wonderful individuals that can offer a lot to the Kenpo community. So, Dennis, give us a little background on the theory of American Kenpo and the discussion of zones.
Well, you know, American Kenpo has many facets to the curriculum. Basically 3, there's basic, self-defense, and freestyle. And then within those, there are concepts and theories and so on and so forth. So those zone concepts are basically placing the individual and developing zones, which have to do with range ultimately. And so, which are related to sparring and, you know, freestyle, you know, sparring and self-defense. You know, and the zones are basically split into 4 zones. We have the height zones, width zones, depth zones, and then obscure zones, which are those of which are behind you and you cannot see. They're out of your eyesight. And so there's zones that are kind of obscure because they're, say, behind you, or if I'm looking up, I can only see so far down, and that area down below that I cannot see then becomes an obscure zone, which is necessary in fighting. So as you look at your opponent in terms of fighting, you want to look at more of a central place. You don't want to look directly at his hairline, because you might be missing some things he's doing with his feet. You don't want to be looking at his feet because you might be missing things with his hands. So the height, width, and depth zones basically are what we're going to talk about and identify those.
The preparatory considerations that we discussed in volume 1 are essentially the forerunner to dealing with the zones, correct?
Well, that's right. Yeah, the eight considerations basically are listed in book 1. There are 8 preparatory considerations in which to try to be victorious, and they are acceptance, you know, accepting the fact that we can be attacked and we need to learn to defend ourselves. So we have acceptance, and then we have environment, range, positions, maneuvers, targets, natural weapons, and natural defenses, of which case the zones are related to, you know, all those areas.
Zach, when you're teaching and you're addressing these issues with students, we have to take the position that they are not aware of any of these theories and concepts. How do you address that with them?
Wow, just breaking it down by action, and in the basic techniques like obscure zone, coming from behind them and showing them that they can't see that. That's out of their peripheral vision. So that would be considered an obscure zone. Breaking the body down into quadrants, as it was done, would probably be another way to break down some zones. But I also like to throw in time as a caveat, because if your opponent is behind you, beside you, in front of you, how much time do you have to initiate a technique or a defense?
Dennis, can you help us with what Zach talked about on quadrants? Because that people are going to confuse. Well, what is a quadrant versus a zone?
Well, quadrants, look, basically split the front and, divide them into looking at a box and splitting the box in half and then paralleling it across. So you split from 12/6 to 3/9, you create 4 quadrants. And, each one of those quadrants have, something to deal to deal with, in terms of, height, width, and depth. And but you're basically, concentrating on one of those quadrants, versus the basic ones. What I'd say to do with and to start with is, first of all, just identify what are the zones anyway. What are the height, width, and depth zones, and then we can start splitting the quadrants for the height zones. And if I may, the height zones are, if you're looking at a body straight ahead and there's somebody standing directly in front of you, the basic height zones are top of the head to solar plexus to groin, groin to feet. And that's the 3 basic height zones. Now, I personally subsplit that myself to head to throat, throat to solar plexus to groin, groin to knee, and knee to feet. And that just splits it just a little bit more technically in terms of, and it relates more when you're starting to fight, because certain areas of those are more susceptible to attack at different times. So I had specific ones, but Mr. Parker goes head, solar plexus, groin, groin to feet. Those 3 major height zones. Now the width zones, as you look at an opponent, are split into basically 4 width zones. You got a person looking at you again straight ahead. If you draw a line right down through their center line, you split the person in half. Then you have the outside shoulder on both sides. And if you split those 2 halves on the half body, you have the right outside shoulder to right center chest, right center to center, center to left center to left outside. So you have 4 basic width zones. Now, if you're in, say, a neutral bow, now you've got a depth zone chart, which there are basically 7 depth zones. You got front hand to front knee, knee to elbow, elbow to shoulder, shoulder to head, head to rear shoulder to rear foot. And so, you got depth zones going back, kind of accordioning, like an accordion, just kind of spanning out. Now, when a person turns sideways, if you have a person straight ahead of you, and when he turns sideways, if you're doing the width zones, you take the 4 wide width zones, and when you turn them sideways, they now minimize themselves. So they're kind of like a Venetian blind. We call that the Venetian blind principle. You kind of narrow your depth zones, in terms of height, width and depth. So, it kind of gets into relating to fighting and what's accessible and what is not, and what's easier to get, what you control through checking, what makes it more difficult. So it's just a basic way to analyze your opponent and what he's giving you to work with.
I'm looking at Zach, and behind him he has the universal pattern. And one of our earlier lessons between us, we had discussed the use of the universal pattern, and I was giving him the 3-dimensional and a concept that I have, and I have ease with that. For some reason, it's just as simple for me to see that. I have a beautiful model that I use, and this was created by Mr. Todd Durgan, and you can get that from him if you want. And I like to think of the universal pattern, and the way I use it, and you're saying 3-dimensional, I like a three-dimensional. You use the reference of a box, but that's good because it's easy for people to see the box. I prefer placing myself inside this ball, so thus I can use it and visualize it a lot easier, because this sphere seems to protect me better and a better understanding than that of a box. Does that make sense to both of you gentlemen?
Well, the box, when you talk about if you look at the universal pattern behind Zach, it's split in half between 12 and 6 and 3 and 9. If you take each one of those 4 quadrants, we're just looking at the universal pattern in a specific manner where we're looking at those 4. We can also use the circle, and if you notice, there's an outside circle and then there's an inside circle. And so there's numerous ways to look at this, and another mention was the outer rim, which is basically an egg-shaped circle that goes from the top of the head to the right outside shoulder down to the groin, then comes back up, which is your main center part of your body. And so we call that the outer rim. And a lot of times we reference that because a lot of people are blocking way outside that rim, which is over blocking. And when you block too far out, it's going to open up something, so you want to keep yourself pretty condensed to work on what you're able to block and how far to block and what you can still protect yourself with and not over block.
A good thing is that it's a subsequent discussion. We'll bring in Mr. Durgan to explain planes and why that is applicable. And I think that is the evolution of the discussion of Mr. Parker's angles. I mean, in the book, he uses a reference to angles. And one of the other tools that I use that Todd has provided is a version of it, of the universal pattern, but it's in half. So you can start to see it as it works in different ways of explaining what Dennis is talking about on, the obscurity, angles of the quadrants, and et cetera. So I think it's very important if visual aids help us to understand a concept a little bit better. Let's go to Zach. Zach, Dennis threw a lot out there on the plate there. What are your thoughts?
It took me back to one of my first lessons and learning how to block, like per se, an inward block as if I'm in a telephone booth. So I wouldn't be extending further than I needed to, which is very common for a young student. And I was taught to break it down in the mirror as to where if I'm doing an inward block, I'm going to my shoulder and no further. So it brought back a lot of memories. So it was nice to hear that. And it's great to hear these discussions because those memories pop up quite often that I wouldn't normally have otherwise.
That's funny you say that because the first lesson I actually had was in learning the block was to actually think within the box, going from my shoulder to my other shoulder and then out and then across. And then, so it was here to that point, and back. And the same thing applied. The box, coming up through the box on the, and as it was, you go up the tube and you angle it, and not this business and the deflection of, say, an upward blocks or that downward block, making sure you stopped at the outside of your box, because if you go too far, the result is not good. So let me show, I'm gonna reference a book right now, and this will help the listeners so that they eventually can use this if they go back. And I have to wear my glasses. There's no way around that. Okay, so if you go to Infinite Insights, Volume 4, Mental and Physical, and you'll deal with this. If you get to page 168, guys, and it basically addresses exactly what Mr. Conatser was saying and explains how Mr. Carter was saying in application. But if you look in it, Parker has in here, he shows the view of that most people have of the universal pattern, very one-dimensional flat. And then he takes that and he starts to rotate it. So he lays it to horizontal position. And then he starts to show that And he goes into this, he calls it the interfaced 9 planes to obtain the illustration shown on the left. So that's on 168. And then he goes back to the uses of angles. And for those that are into this visually, there we are. And you can see there's the universal pattern behind Mr. Carter. And then the 3D example that I talked about, and I've circled the part of planes that Mr. Durgan likes to reference to. And it really actually helps a lot because he enumerates it so that you can reference it. And then on the other side, you can see how that works. So let's get into some of this stuff. You can see, you know, if you look into the 9 planes, you know, plane number 1, let's walk through them, Mr. Conatser, and let's talk about it. So what is plane 1?
If I'm not mistaken, plane 1 is kind of like the flat plane going around your waist,
Correct.
going all around your body, all the way out, and that kind of gives you a circumference around your body. It's 1, you know, then there's 2,
Let's look at
which
this
could
one.
be another one farther out, right? And so that's the very top of the ball there is plane 1.
Well, this is it. Yeah, this is a flat surface. I'm going to use for this this discussion the use of this tool, half dimension of it. So plane 1, here is plane 1. Plane 2 is this, around from the top
That's going from the top of your head
to your feet.
shoulder to shoulder, and going around your body, you know, vertically going all the way around. So it's basically taking the other one and turning it.
So we
Yeah.
went from here 1 to 2. So if the man was here, this would he be in here?
Correct.
Okay. Plane 3, if he is standing or facing you, it is from front to back. So it would be like this, like, I hate to say it, do it that way, but it'd be like this.
Goes from 12 to 6, but it goes through you and it goes all the way back behind you.
Yeah.
Way
Cuts you
forward.
right in half.
Cuts you in half, and that's plane 3.
Plane 4 is angled. So it is now, instead of like plane 1, I'm going to go side view of it. It's this way.
Well, do it toward the front. So let's say we're facing front. So you do plane 1, which is flat, and do plane 1. Just roll back to plane 1 again. Now just tip it forward right there to 130, 730, 1030, 430, and that's plane 4.
4.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
You get into plane 5. Actually, just it has, it's an interesting diagram for that, and you want to talk about that one? I want to use the
plane 5 takes plane 2, which goes from your head to your right shoulder to your left shoulder. So we're doing that one. So just hold the universal back up again, and that's plane 2 right there. He's circling around, and all he does now for plane 5 is rotate the left side forward a little bit, and so you're going to move your left side, just the opposite, the other side, right? Not straight. Right there. Right there that's plane 5. Okay,
interesting. So plane 6 is the opposite of well, actually, it's not. 6 goes from this angle.
6 goes from right, exactly like that. It goes from 1030 to 430. It's splitting the body on that diagonal angle. 7
is the opposite of 5.
Goes from a
5
flat.
was this, so now it's going upward.
Well, okay, put it flat like 1, and now from there, if you tilt the front toward me, tilt it up, just the opposite, right there. Now, if you remember where the circle was, that's plane 7.
Minus all this, you got to understand that in the diagrams, it doesn't have it 3-dimensional. So it would be better if we actually used something like Sun Tzu, like this, you know, this, and this, and this, and this,
That's
and
correct.
this. So it makes it a lot easier when it's one-dimensional rather than 3. Talking about plane, this plane number 8. Plane 8.
Okay, plane 8 is basically as you're looking at the person straight on, it's tilting from 130 vertically to 730. So it's kind of cutting you off at a diagonal across through your body, that way. That's plane 8. And plane 9 is
Final.
the final one. It's the opposite to plane 8. Instead of cutting from
You
the
mean
top,
the opposite of 6?
it's the opposite. I'm sorry, 6 is what I meant to say. It's the opposite of 6. So it's going the opposite direction. Instead of doing the diagonal from the right side down to the left, it's doing the opposite. It's going from 1030 down to 430 and splitting on a diagonal. So it's it's almost better when we have the pictures to show these, so we can insert those into the discussion, because they do get a little bit texy, to understand those planes, because I don't talk about planes. I talk about planes, but I don't really reference them that much. I talk a little more just about the zones, not so much on the planes. But the planes I do talk about when you talk about, I use those more when you talk about orbiting. When you're going, like, say, from an inward block and you orbit into a right inward elbow, so I talk about using those different planes that the block actually works on, and then you go from that block into another plane. So you can really, take it, it gets intellectually and anatomically fairly deep on these things, where you start moving into what's open in different areas and what you're taught to do. And of course, that goes back to your basics. All of your basics, if taught properly, there's basics taught on all these planes. So there's things you can do from this plane and this plane and this plane. We don't usually talk about that, at least, in my side, we don't talk that much. Todd Durgan is really good on this, and he really explains it very well. And he's made it a point to really work on the planes. And the way he teaches at his school, he teaches a lot with the planes.
Would you consider the planes, Zach, as intangible or tangible?
I would have to say they're tangible, because you can move within them. So, I mean, every technique you do, everything can be broken down. And if I'm not mistaken, it's all based on kinesiology. Is that not correct, Mr. C?
Well, when practicing, by yourself, you're learning to move with your basics on intangible, hypothetical planes. So
Yes.
we have these patterns that we work on, but the purpose of that is to learn the maneuvers, so that when in real combat, if you're faced with an opponent close, you take the intangible and turn it into tangible.
Tangible. Yeah, I was always taught, when doing forms or anything, do it as if your opponent is yourself. And that's when I remember using mirrors in the schools, and so I wouldn't get out of my box zone per se when doing blocks or any of that.
Well, I always tell people, good Kempoists get a love affair going with the mirrors. I did a lot of fighting with myself, shadow boxing, if you will. And as I looked in the mirror, I'm actually fighting. I was pretending to fight that guy. And I noticed that when I threw a back knuckle to that guy, my ribs were open, because I had my arm extended to his head. Now, I'm not going to leave my arm hanging out there, but for that instant, when I threw it out there, if he happened to pick the right timing on that and put the proper speed and time together, he could duck my back fist and hit me with a cross to my ribs, and I would be totally open. And so it would be a matter of how fast I threw the back knuckle and how fast I recovered it, which is an element of time, on how well you time your movements, because timing can either leave you open or take advantage of your opponent's opening.
So let me go
Either-
back. Let me interrupt you guys both for a second. So your belief is it's a tangible. Is it tangible because you can visualize it, or do you actually see it?
I see it. If I'm throwing a block, I see the punch coming at me. So to me, it's all that visualization that I'm using within the mirror or within myself, whether I'm doing forms or techniques or basics, even.
How about you, sir?
Yeah, I concur. I think that's right. I mean, you know, when you're practicing, there's obviously nobody in front of you, so it's all in your mind what you're actually mentally visualizing. But if you visualize properly, the more you visualize in your mind in practice, when it happens, of course, you still need to train it. You got to train with a live person as well. You can't just train in the air. You train with a live person, and then you actually can put together the stuff that you did learn, and you know how to move these things from intangible into actual real tangibles. And you'll know that when you can actually score or hit with it, and it's not just a hypothetical, it becomes a reality.
I use visuals other than the use of a teaching tool like the three-dimensional universal pattern. A lot of my beginning was to go and use things that were at my disposal, like the wall. And I would use the wall to make sure I understood where that outward block was going to be and felt it and could see it, or the inward block, I could see where it was, or any other device. So what we've dealt with so far, height, width, depth, that's 3. Fourth one was the obscurity. So now it takes me to my next question, and I'm going to quote the great Rod Sterling. There is a 5th dimension, that which is known to man is the dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pits of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. It is something that I really believe in. Zach and I discuss this all the time. Usage of this element, this dimension, better known as time. Talk about that, Mr. Carter. Time. Why is that an important
Well,
element?
time has a lot of relevance. First of all, do you have more than one opponent? Is one opponent 6 feet away from you? Is another opponent off to your 9 o'clock, 3 feet away from you? What is the range? We can deal within ranges of contact. You have out of contact range, in contact range, and contact manipulation. So time definitely relates to all that. Are you going to have time to execute a part of a technique or just a block and go into something else? Or are you going to use time to run away if you have enough distance? So there's all kinds of factors of time that can be involved with that. And I think it's often overlooked. And also time relates in how you execute your techniques and create those openings for that too.
It's funny you say that because two of the seniors that I've had conversations with deal with time in different ways. Mike Stone looks at it as the power of now. Be in the moment. When you're in the moment, you can flow. Therefore, that which presents itself will present it. You will be able to act naturally and respond to it. Joe Steve Muhammad calls it his mind sight. He can actually see the flow as it's happening. Thus, the time element presents him the options to respond correctly. How do you feel about that, Dennis? Tell us about time. Did Mr. Parker talk about time?
You know, we talked about timing, which was the timing of a move, the timing of an opponent coming at you, because everybody comes at you with a different timing. Some people kind of, you know, use foot maneuvers to slide in and rush you and you know, then cock a leg up and kick, and you have so much time to either get out of the way, jam it, off angle it, or, you know, duck under it, you know, several different things. There's a lot of different ways to utilize timing. Didn't talk about time per se, but it's certainly relevant. You know, how much time does it take to cross over this way or that way, and what can we do and what can we not do? You know, and it also has to do with the angle of the strike or block that you're doing, what angle are you doing it on? And I like to use, for example, sword and hammer. You know, you bring the hand up, you don't bring it in front of you, in front of your face, and then chop outwards. You bring it from your point of origin with your hands usually at your side, and you slide up his body, which is out of his basic awareness zone. It's in his obscurity, and you come up and you can actually hit him in the throat before he even knows what hit him, because you kind of came up in his obscure zone. And if you do it fast enough, if your physical speed comes up that body fast enough, you know, it becomes an awesome weapon in time.
I think that the element of combat is what we're discussing here, and we're engaging in it, and your response to your opponent is determined by your eight considerations that we discussed in Infinite Insights number 1. We look at the planes that we have dealt with, the zones that we've talked about so far. I think we've identified 5. So we've expanded on Mr. Parker's concept in theory of the zones, and we're going to go into that a little more. It's interesting on that. Parker his only comment I get out of the Book of Zen that I have in here so far is simply, he said, let time be your measurement to skill and experience. But he also says, let time and experience determine what is or isn't useful. So I guess he's using a measurement of time as a way to determine the practicality of what you are trying to accomplish. But in the moment, the split moment, we're talking about combat. And I think this question has been presented many times. I know that you've addressed it, Dennis. When asked, would you use 5 swords on the street? And you can tell what Mr. Parker would say. I know that Steve Muhammad, in his early days of a martial artist, thought he could go to a tournament and use 5 swords in the tournament. And he lost, and he didn't understand why that didn't work for him. But eventually he realized what did work for him, and he utilized time to its greatest benefit for himself. What was Mr. Parker's attitude about preconceived responses in time of combat?
Well, you know, the curriculum, all the techniques that we have in the system, where we have basically 154 variation techniques, and give or take, there's another 20, you know, miscellaneous techniques that we have as well. But all those, basically, I consider them all simply drills to develop skills. You know, they're not necessarily meant to be completed on the street. However, that being said, it's not impossible to do one and actually complete the technique sequence. But that's not your goal. Your goal is not to necessarily complete 5 swords on the street. It all depends on what you're given. You need to be able to work with what you're given, not what you want to give. Your response needs to be, you know, equation oriented. In other words, it's got to be, you know, defense oriented to what your person throws at you, and then you respond accordingly. And that could be a whole technique, or it can be just a part, or it could be a grafting of 2 different techniques together.
Zach, time. You started to mention it because you based it on the time to respond because of distance. It would seem that if someone's closer to you, they would have less time, or you would have less time to respond. They would have the advantage of you. But when you think about time is relative to the moment, if you go back to the preparatory considerations, you anticipate that. There's a really clever movie if you watch Robert Downey Jr. and he does Sherlock Holmes, and they show him in slow motion responding to his opponent in a battle, and he's calculating it. Do you ever experience that yourself?
That is perceptual time
Okay.
that you think you're going to be able to react. But like in one incident that I've talked to you that happened many years ago, where I was attacked in a parking lot for some reason, I can't explain it. I just reacted. I did parry, and then I went right into a choke. I don't know how I did it. I just did it. And as Mr. C was talking about, the techniques are lessons in motion. You know, develop those skills that you'll be able to use them. But I doubt very seriously many people are going to pull off 5 swords in a fight, but they might pull off parts of that. And of course, time plays into that role, because you also have to consider the other elements, your environmental elements. Are there other people coming in? Are there weapons involved? I mean, this is why, to me, time is so relevant in these conversations, and not enough people talk about it. Not only timing, which is a function of time, your reaction time, and then your execution time to pull this off. Now, are you going to be able to plan it out like Sherlock Holmes did? I doubt it. But after so many training hours and in theory and lessons in motion, you're probably going to be able to react. And this is getting into the power of now without even thinking about it. And that's why you train like you're going to go to war. You train like you're going to fight. So when this happens, your body will just react, and you will be in that moment of now.
I think one of the things that was really essential is preparation. Your training will happen. So thus, as Mike Stone said, you know, you're in the moment now. You're not thinking, you're reacting. And essentially, if you look at what he's talking about, you don't have a second chance, because it could, in that situation, we're talking about life or death. When you look at a tournament, that's a point. Oh, the official got you, still walk away, and you might have a bloody nose, or you could something worse. You know, we've seen that at tournaments. But the question is are you prepared to respond correctly? And I think, I think Sun Tzu said it right off the bat. And this goes back to what Dennis talked about in the 8 considerations. And you just go back through that, folks. We've had a discussion on that before. He says, Sun Tzu says, the good fighter is able to secure himself against defeat. Okay, he can secure himself. Why? Because he makes sure he has the proper time and the reaction to it. If he has enough time, he can create distance. If he has enough distance, he can create time. They're sort of interchangeable. It's something that I always push toward the students, because, you know, you don't have to be right in there. Create some distance. Give yourself more opportunity. If we're not sure of how to respond, it's a simple response. You know what? That's a good question, sir. I'll get back to you about that. Right, Dennis?
Don't think, feel. I was thinking that was something Zach said. You know, he's talking about perceptual. What we're talking about too is the elements of speed. So talking about speed, you got perceptual speed, which is how you perceive the speed. And then that rolls into your mental speed. Your brain then takes that perception and then analyzes it, and then sends out messages to your body to actually function and actually move into what we consider application and responses. And the response time, whatever time it takes that from perceptual to mental to actual physical response, takes time. And that is where time comes in. There's a mental time to respond, and that's what it takes, to work. Then in your mind, your eyes and ears and all your senses have to react to whatever's coming at you, and thus your response. And that's all predicated on your basic type of training. How much training have you done? Are you really prepared for war? Or have you just trained for tournaments? And not that tournaments are bad, but you got to train for, sometimes, it's good to put the gloves on and go out there and actually get hit, or let somebody try to hit you to see if you can actually block it or not. So it's a different part of training.
Zach, you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, Mr. C, isn't that why Mr. Parker considered the techniques and even forms and sets lessons in motion, so you could develop those skills to react without necessarily thinking when you were confronted with a situation?
Well, that's exactly right. We're all creatures of habit. And like in basketball, football, baseball, anything, we need to train our bodies. Playing soccer, for example, nobody, we walk all the time, but we use our hands more than anything, in a daily life. So our hands are more, we're our society of hand-eye coordination for the most part. To learn to do soccer moves where your arms are basically cut off, except for a couple of positions where you're throwing the ball in, or a goalie where you can actually use your hands. But the major players, it's all feet. Now you've got to learn how to dribble with your feet and do all kinds of moves, dribbling, passing, and that takes training to be able to take that ball and learn to do that drill, which obviously people can do at a high level if trained. Same thing in football and basketball, same thing, just different skills.
It's funny, we're talking here of what we're seeing here, and there is so much here that needs to be discussed and developed and what such. And this is all foundational. This is all foundational. This, as I've had numerous seniors say to me, the art is perfect. We just need to understand the art. And once you're in that moment with the art, these will be revealed to you. You can't say, well, I don't like this, so I'm not going to do it, or I don't understand that, so I'm not going to accept it. Sometimes it is beneficial to go and work very hard at those things that are presented to you so that you'll have a better understanding how that may present itself. The ideas of the use of time. I mean, most people, there's a quote, very famous quote from the Dalai Lama. You don't have as much time as you think you have. And that's really an important point to the discussion. Like Zach said, I mean, when he was confronted, he just reacted, his natural training. He's been training in the martial arts now. This is 2021. That's almost 30 years. Am I right there, Zach?
Yeah, 1989 is when I started in a version of Tracy Kenpo.
Okay, and in your time, has your perception during this period of time, has this preference, has it changed?
Dramatically. It reminds me of one of my favorite quotes. William Blake said, when the doors of perception are cleansed, a man will see things as they truly are, infinite. And it's like when you read a book, okay, we can equate it to learning a technique. When you learn that at a certain belt level, you see that technique at a certain way. But when you constantly revisit that technique, you will see it a completely different way, and maybe even for a different situation. So the more I'm around this art, the more I understand how deep and analytical Mr. Parker was. I can't honestly believe that, I mean, I know some techniques work against people, but I think everything he did had a purpose. So to me, if you don't understand a technique, instead of just discarding it, ask yourself, what was Mr. Parker trying to teach with this technique? Or contact someone like what we're doing now and get involved and talk to other people and get a different perception. And maybe that will open the door up for you to see that technique and that lesson that Mr. Parker was trying to impart.
Dennis, your thoughts?
No, that's exactly right. Every technique that was created for a specific situation. Every front push is not the same. Like there could be a strong front push, there could be a medium front push, there could be a very light front push, and it could be one hand could be stronger than the other, which would maybe tilt your body one way or the other. There's many factors in terms of the attack, and the techniques were developed and not always taught, for various reasons, for the specific reason or analogy of what this particular technique is for. Each technique was specifically for something. It's a hypothetical situation a lot of times, but a lot of the techniques were born out of questions during the class when somebody either had been attacked by X move, this move, that move, or whatever, or they were talked about that an attack like this could happen, and here's what we potentially could do. And so we're going to learn how to step back, step forward, step to the left, off angle, block this way, strike that way. And so we learn how to do all these moves, and we become a person of options, which, there's no specific answer for each one of us. Each one of us needs to find our own path of application. The movements that we learn are there, but we've got to learn to internalize our movements and be able to react when we get attacked, not hypothetically what's on the books. What's on the books doesn't matter. What belt we wear doesn't matter. How many tournaments we've won doesn't matter. What matters is how we utilize and apply, a response to a given stimulus.
There's a very famous quote by Ed Parker, and I think we've had a talk about this one time, Dennis, on truth. What is truth? What is truth? And I think you can probably say it if you want, but I think, it's really actually the moment of truth is during combat.
Well,
You're either prepared or you're not, and it's going to result, and it may be the end of your life. And you have to think of the consequences of what's going to result. Once you explain, because you've had this discussion with Ed Parker, what was Mr. Parker's beliefs or thoughts on that?
Well, what I was going to say is what's truth for one may not be truth for another. And the situation for one may not be the exact same as the other. So each person has to walk his own path. And the system, the curriculum, basically lays out the foundation and the basics and the maneuvers of what you possibly could do. And they teach all these elements: timing, speed, blocks, punches, kicks, foot maneuvers, all this kind of thing, stances, etc. But it's up to us then to make it, we have to buy into it ourselves and put our own stamp on it. And it's not you that, can defend yourself. It's me that needs to be able to do it. And that's what I need to utilize the curriculum for, is to gain skill, not belts, not tournament trophies, but skills with. Now, all those things help. Belts are nothing more than an encouragement, but it still doesn't mean you're going to be a killer.
Sure. I think the point we've just scratched the surface tonight on the zone theories, and those zone theories are so important to the listener and to us as practitioners, because it helps us to identify those areas that we should be concerned with in combat. Remember, the techniques are just, as you would say, drills to improve skills. They're just working problems with possible solutions and scenarios. The forms are a collection of those techniques put together. Now, the question is, how do you do the transition from learning your basics to sophisticated basics with fighting, with your techniques, then in practical application, which is true combat? And as I mentioned earlier, I think, Mr. Parker, the moment of truth is determined right when you're in front of the individual. Do you know what you're going to do? I don't know. You don't know. I'm sorry.
In other words, everybody's got a plan until they're punched in the face.
Exactly. And we can use reference books by, Mr. Parker, by Sun Tzu, Miyamoto Musashi, and those are important. I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting, a quote. Here's a very interesting quote. It is this. It says, "The truth is not found in a book. Truth is not to be found in a book. Furthermore, such a book merely presents a barrier to progress in your search for truth." What he's basically saying there is saying you have to learn by experience, by actually application, practical ability to be able to execute that at the moment you're confronted. Zach talked about something that happened to him a few years ago. He doesn't understand why. He responded. It was natural. Why? Because he was in the moment, as Mr. Stone would say. He was in the moment. He was focused. The individual did not matter to him. He didn't care about that. He was going to respond because his body told him how to do it. His eyes perceived it. And then his mind sight reacted to it. And it sent that signal through him. And his training took over. And this was within milliseconds. I can't even say it that fast, how fast we can think. And
nanoseconds.
It's there. And that quote comes from Bruce Lee. Now, Bruce was a big fan of Tao Te Ching. He also studied with Mike Stone. He studied and trained with Sijo Steve Muhammad. He had Ip Man. He looked and he was a sponge. So he was constantly trying to embrace that. The lesson we learned from that is that this dialogue here is much more helpful than just to read the book. Because if you were to read the books, you're going to get one perception of it and one interpretation. And then, as Zach mentioned earlier, it'll be completely different another day because the circumstances have changed. His life and what was happening with him is different. So we will expand with this and we will continue on with this. So before I close, I want to say, is there anything you want to add, Zach?
Well, I like to touch on that. It's, talking about perception. If I'm in a seminar, let's say with Mr. C, and I do a technique a certain way, well, that technique might work, but Mr. C might come up and go, well, think about this and change my total perception. Well, that changes the technique, but it also deals with what you were talking about, the power of now, being in that moment. And I mean, we can go down the rabbit's hole with this and go many different ways. But the point that I always go back to is when I hear people talk about, that technique doesn't work, this technique doesn't work. I don't believe all the years that I've been in this now, and I haven't been in it as long as you gentlemen, Mr. Parker did everything for a reason. Everything that he broke down, his mind, his analytical thought. Now, when I was coming up, I came up through the Tracy system. Okay, that was an earlier version, if I'm not incorrect, maybe the 60s version of Kenpo. Okay, now as I learned the IKKA version through Mr. Solis and thus Mr. Trejo, I got to that was my first peek into the mindset of what Mr. Parker was doing. And a lot of it made sense to me, even from the first technique, the laid sword, which was almost an opposite technique that I learned in the Tracy system. It made sense. What did it teach me? Marriage of gravity. Okay, that one little instant, I was like, wow, an aha moment. So to me, I was just beginning my journey at that time into understanding what Mr. Parker and how his mind process worked. Now, since then, I've learned from gentlemen that were around Mr. Parker, such as you gentlemen, and I've got to see even more into that rabbit hole. So what has that definitively done over time? It's changed my perception on how I look at things. Now, do I look at things and go, do I have all the answers? No, but what it does do is sometimes you have to shut up. You have to listen. You have to learn from another gentleman. Even how many times has someone taught someone a technique and learned something from a student? Wow. And I had an aha moment. It happens all the time. So you have to keep those doors of perception open, which again, I'm getting deep here. We're going back into the now. You're living in the moment of the now, which is the only moment we can all truly control. Think about that for a second. It's the only moment we can control is now. So we train like we fight so we can control the moment of now. And I believe that's what Mr. Stone was alluding to in your interview with him, which just really moved me because it's along the same kinds of lines and theories of which I've been thinking for many years. Mr. C, your comment on that?
Well, several things on that, and in closing, we talk about reading books. You can read books all the time. And I can point out to you people that have read books, but they didn't know what to focus on. So they've read books, but did they focus on this, that, or the other? And if I go back and say, okay, what about this? Can you tell me about that? And they go, oh, gee, I said, well, have you read it? And they go, well, yeah, I read it, but did you focus on it? Did you really study it? And, you know, we almost need to go back to the books and say, okay, let's take book one, everybody, and let's have a class on book one for a semester, and actually just like a class in school, and actually go through the book and actually chapter to chapter, actually study what's in there versus just reading it or glossing over it.
I think I'll use the quote from Mr. Conatser. Please set me straight if I put them in the wrong order. How much Kenpo do you know? How much Kenpo do you know of? How much Kenpo do you understand? And how much Kenpo can you apply?
Yeah, well, yeah, the saying is, you almost got it right. It's how much Kenpo do you, how much, yeah.
Thank you. Get it, straighten me out. So I did qualify that. Come on.
No, it's good. You had all the parts. The question,
It was just in the right order.
how much Kenpo do you know of?
Okay, good.
Well, that's the beginning, and everybody knows of X amount, a lot, let's say. Then, but you break that down into asking the next question, which, how much do you actually know? Well, that's going to be probably a little bit less than you know of. The third one is, how much do you actually understand? That's going to be a little bit less than you know. And then finally, how much can you apply? So you know of, you understand, and apply. And each one of those takes a considerable amount of time to, in terms of the system, in terms of applying what you've learned in the system. And eventually the goal is to be able to apply whatever you need during the time of need. That's the goal.
I heard of a story about a person, and then I met this person, and then I tried to understand this person, and then I was at Zach's bar and I threw this person out.
The one thing you can never buy is experience. You have to live it.
So there you go. So anyway, this is the beginning of this Beyond Infinite Insights discussions of certain parts of Mr. Parker's writings. And again, the influences of other people. And as you can see, there's so many facets of the martial arts collectively brought into the mindset of Edmund Parker and how he came up with American Kenpo. And I am really thankful that both of you could be a part of this tonight. We will continue this. It's going to be an ongoing series. I know that we'll have other interviews and whatnot. And I want to say thank you to both of you. So thank you, Mr. Carter. Thank you, Mr. Conatser. God bless y'all. And that is it. And we're going to say good night.
Good night.
Good night.